For nearly 4 years of war, there was one place the Kremlin was certain it could never lose. Not the front, not Crimea. A quiet industrial town in the far north called Ukhta in the Komi Republic, roughly 1,750 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. That is a distance the entire world had filed under impossible. The kind of reach that belongs to cruise missiles and strategic bombers, not to small propeller aircraft assembled in a workshop and launched off a stretch of road. So Russia did what every empire does with ground it believes is untouchable. It built its lifeblood there far behind the war, and it stopped looking up. On the morning of February 12, 2026, that certainty caught fire. A handful of Ukrainian drones crossed almost the entire width of European Russia and slammed into the Lukoil refinery at Ukhta in what Kyiv described as the longest confirmed drone strike of the war. Thick black smoke climbed over the plant. The local airport was shut, and inside that column of smoke was a message every Russian planner understood instantly. There is no longer a rear. The map of places Russia believed were safe had just stopped existing. So let's trace exactly how the safest corner of the empire became its front line and what it means for the war machine that runs on it. To understand why a fire in an obscure northern town shook Moscow, you first have to understand the fortress Russia spent centuries building. It was never made of walls, it was made of distance. Russia is the largest country on Earth spanning 11 time zones. For 300 years, that size was its armor. Napoleon's army marched into an empty Moscow and froze in the geography around it. Hitler's divisions stalled and starved in the same endless space. The lesson the Kremlin took from history was simple and absolute. You can lose a border, you can lose a city, but you can always retreat deeper, because there is always more Russia behind you. Somewhere past the front, there is always a safe rear. That single idea shaped how Russia fought this war. The danger was the front. The interior was the sanctuary. So the country tucked its most valuable machinery deep in that sanctuary, hundreds and hundreds of kilometers from any Ukrainian soldier. To grasp how deep Ukhta really is, consider this. 1,750 kilometers is farther than the distance Russian columns first pushed when they rolled toward Kyiv in 2022. Ukraine did not just match that arrow, it reversed it, and then it extended it past anything Moscow thought possible. And in that safe interior, Russia placed the thing that matters most to a country at war: its energy empire. Russia is one of the largest oil and fuel exporters on the planet, and among the top oil producers in the world. It runs 33 major refineries that turn crude oil into the diesel, the gasoline, and the jet fuel that move armies. According to the Atlantic Council, oil and gas revenues have funded around 40% of the entire federal budget. Sit with that number. Nearly half of everything the Russian state spends, including this war, has traditionally come out of the ground and through those refineries. This is not one industry among many. This is the bloodstream. It is what pays the soldiers, builds the missiles, and keeps the offensive alive month after month after month. Think about what that bloodstream actually does in wartime. Every shell fired, every tank fueled, every contract soldier paid, every drone and missile purchased from abroad ultimately traces back to a barrel of oil sold or a refinery still running. A modern army does not run on courage. It runs on logistics, and logistics run on fuel and on cash. Russia had both in abundance, pumped from beneath its own soil, and processed in plants it assumed were forever beyond the reach of the fighting. That is what made the energy empire feel less like an industry and more like the foundation the entire war was standing on. Cut a front line and you lose ground you can perhaps retake later. Cut the bloodstream and the whole body begins to fail slowly from the inside in a way no counterattack can reverse. Moscow understood this perfectly. It is exactly why it believed those refineries had to be kept far, far away from any danger. So Moscow guarded what it was afraid to lose. Around the capital, around the front, around its highest value targets, Russia layered some of the densest air defense networks in the world. Rings of S-300 and S-400 systems, each interceptor worth around $1 million, designed to swat down anything that flew. The Russian military planned for the war. It expected an enemy coming at its borders and its cities from the west. But the deep interior was a different story. Refineries scattered across the heartland near the Urals in the far north and Siberia sat far from the front and largely undefended against air attack because no one in the Kremlin seriously believed a weapon could ever reach them. Why spend $1 billion in interceptors guarding a plant 2,000 kilometers from any front line? And for most of the war, that logic held. The deep refineries kept humming. The crude kept flowing. The money kept arriving in the treasury. The fortress of distance was doing its job exactly as it had against every invader for 3 centuries. There was just one assumption holding the entire structure together, that the sky over the heartland was Russian, permanently, and that nothing small and cheap could ever travel far enough to threaten the engine room of the war. But every fortress has a fatal flaw, and Russia's was never a wall. It was the assumption that 1,750 kilometers of open sky could not be crossed. Let's start with what actually crossed it. The strike on Ukhta was carried out by long-range drones of the Security Service of Ukraine operated by its Alpha Special Operations Center. According to the SBU, the target sat 1,750 kilometers from the border, a new distance record for Ukrainian-made drones. And the damage was not random. Preliminary reports pointed to fires at the refinery's atmospheric and vacuum distillation unit, the section that performs the primary refining of crude, and at its visbreaking unit, which breaks down heavy residue into usable fuel oil and lighter products like gasoline. In plain terms, the drones did not just light a fire in a parking lot. They struck the organs that make a refinery a refinery. The Ukhta plant, part of the Lukoil empire, processes around 4 million tons of oil a year and feeds the Russian armed forces. And here is the part that should have frightened Moscow most. This was not a lucky one-off. The previous distance record was a radar station at Orsk near the Kazakh border, struck back in 2024 at roughly 1,500 kilometers. Ukhta beat it. And by the spring of 2026, Ukrainian drones had reportedly hit 24 of Russia's 33 major refineries in at least 158 strikes since 2022. They were reaching plants in Bashkortostan around 1,500 kilometers away, and even refineries deep in Siberia. Every single one of those 33 refineries was now, in principle, a target. The defensive problem this created for Russia has no clean solution, because you cannot wrap an entire continent in air defense. But reach was only the first thing Russia lost. The second was the math. For years, deep strikes were the privilege of wealthy nations, because the weapons that flew that far cost a fortune. That is exactly the rule Ukraine broke. The aircraft most associated with these strikes is the Liutyi, built by the legendary aircraft maker Antonov. It carries a warhead of around 50 to 75 kilograms, flies between 1,000 and 2,000 kilometers, and uses a blend of artificial intelligence, satellite, and inertial navigation that makes it stubbornly resistant to Russian jamming. Crucially, it is assembled armed and launched off an ordinary stretch of road while the crew scatters before Russia can hit the launch site. It costs roughly $200,000 per unit. Analysts have nicknamed it the Tomahawk for the poor. And the Liutyi is not even the cheapest option. A largely plywood drone called the FP-1 reportedly costs around $55,000, can fly up to 1,600 kilometers, and by late 2025 accounted for the majority of Ukrainian strikes inside Russia, with production running in the hundreds of units per day. Now set that against what it costs to stop them. A single American Tomahawk cruise missile runs around $2 million. A Storm Shadow around $3 million, an S-400 Interceptor around $1 million each. When Ukraine sends a swarm of 20 of these workshop drones at one refinery, the arithmetic simply collapses. Russia spends more shooting them down than Ukraine spent building them, and even then it cannot stop them all because no air defense network on Earth can stand guard everywhere across 11 time zones at once. For an American audience, this is the part worth sitting with. Western programs to defend against small drones are now being priced in the range of $100 million to $600 million for single initiatives. That is the cost of trying to defend. The offensive side of the very same equation, the side Ukraine is on, is a drone that costs less than a family car, and Germany alone reportedly put up around $100 million to fund 500 more Liutyi aircraft. This is the heart of the inversion. A cheap machine is now reaching what only multi-million-dollar weapons could before, and it is hitting the single most valuable asset the empire owns, its money supply. The side that is cheaper to attack with than to defend against does not lose this kind of war on arithmetic. Before we follow the next artery being cut, one quick thing. If this is the kind of strategic breakdown you came here for, subscribe, because the map only gets more interesting from here. Now back to the siege. The third layer is the tempo. A single record strike is a headline. What is actually strangling Russia is the relentless rhythm behind it. Up to this point in 2026, Ukrainian strikes on oil targets had already surpassed the total for all of 2024, after more than 140 strikes across 2025 alone. In April of 2026 by itself, Ukraine hit Russian oil targets, refineries, export terminals, and pipeline pumping stations at least 21 times. And the strikes were not just frequent, they were getting better. The Ukrainian analysis group Frontelligence Insight found that more than half of the strikes in an earlier stretch had limited effect. But that changed sharply as Ukraine fielded better drones with bigger, smarter warheads. The campaign learned from its own failures. The Tuapse refinery on the Black Sea was struck a fourth time in 2 weeks in early May, reigniting fires the Russian emergency ministry had already claimed to have put out. Strikes hit major plants at Novorossiysk, at Ryazan, at Kstovo, and the Syzran refinery was confirmed shut after an attack. The list keeps growing. Ukrainian drones struck the Saratov refinery, and an oil pumping station hit a storage site for imported drone parts in Tatarstan and kept returning to plants they had already damaged, because a repaired refinery is simply a target waiting to be hit again. At Tuapse, fires were reported burning for days. Russia would announce one blaze extinguished, and the drones would come back and reignite it. There is a psychology buried in that rhythm. It tells every refinery manager, every regional governor, and every soldier on a fence line the same thing. You are next, and there is nothing reliable you can do about it. This is the difference between a raid and a siege. A raid happens once. A siege arrives every single week and never lets the fires fully go out. The fourth layer is what all that tempo adds up to on the balance sheet of Russian refining. By May of 2026, according to Reuters, the refineries that had either fully halted or sharply cut output came to a combined annual capacity of more than 83 million tons, around 238,000 tons of processing lost every single day. Reuters sources put that at nearly a quarter of Russia's entire refining capacity. Those plants alone accounted for more than 30% of the country's gasoline production and around 25% of its diesel. One of Russia's largest refineries, Kurishi, with a capacity of 20 million tons a year, was knocked completely offline on May 5th. Another giant, the Nizhny Novgorod plant at 17 million tons a year, came under attack on May 20th. These are not minor facilities. These are pillars of the national fuel supply going dark one after another. The numbers tell the same story from every direction. Russia's average refinery throughput fell to about 4.69 million barrels per day, the lowest level since December of 2009, 16 years earlier. And when Moscow simply stopped publishing fuel output to bury the damage, its own statistics agency gave it away anyway. The April report from Rosstat showed production of oil products down 9.2% from a year earlier, even as the rest of Russian industry grew by about 3%. The fuel sector was the lone casualty in an otherwise steady economy. The fortress was bleeding in the exact place that mattered most, and the bleeding was now showing up in Moscow's own official numbers. And here is what a quarter of refining going offline actually means downstream. A country cannot simply buy back the fuel it no longer makes, not at this scale and not while under sanctions. So the shortfall has to come out of somewhere. Either out of the exports the treasury depends on, or out of the fuel ordinary Russians put in their tanks. There is no third option. Moscow would soon be forced to choose between the money and the home front, and it would slowly discover that it could not fully protect either one. And what the refineries could no longer produce, the ports could no longer ship. That is the fifth layer, and it is where the siege reached the open sea. In March of 2026, Reuters described what was happening to Russian oil exports as the most severe supply disruption in modern Russian history. At one point, roughly 40% of Russia's oil export capacity, about 2 million barrels a day, was knocked offline. Loadings were repeatedly suspended at Primorsk and Ust-Luga, the two largest Baltic ports. The Black Sea terminal at Novorossiysk, with a capacity of around 700,000 barrels a day, fell behind schedule after drone attacks. And pipeline exports to Hungary and Slovakia through the Druzhba line had been effectively halted since January. Russia was left shuffling its crude between a shrinking set of exits, diverting output toward the Baltic and toward the port of Murmansk on the Barents Sea, hunting for any door still open to the world. With the global market already tightened by the war involving Iran, every barrel Russia could not move arrived at the worst possible moment. Every barrel that cannot be refined or shipped is a barrel that cannot be turned into money, and money was always the real front. That is the sixth layer, and it is the one Putin cannot patch with reserves or clever accounting. Remember the figure from the start: oil and gas funding around 40% of the federal budget. That is the artery the drones are aiming at deliberately and patiently. By late May of 2026, analysts estimated that the campaign against Russian oil was costing Moscow on the order of $100 million a day. The Kremlin's own 2026 budget was drawn up on a lower oil price, openly trying to reduce the share of revenue coming from oil and gas, which is itself a quiet confession of how exposed that revenue has become. And the Paris-based International Energy Agency assessed that the impact of the drone strikes would suppress Russian refinery processing rates into at least the middle of 2026. Read all of that together, and the strategy becomes clear. This is no longer a war about taking ground on a map. It has become a war about cutting the single artery that feeds the war itself and forcing Moscow to keep fighting on a shrinking budget. But the deepest wound was never going to appear in an export ledger or a budget table. It showed up at the gas pump. This is where the logistical noose turns into something far more dangerous to the Kremlin than any battlefield map. Because the same strikes that bled Russia's exports also did the unthinkable to its self-image. The nation that parades itself as an energy superpower can no longer reliably keep its own drivers on the road. By the autumn of 2025, the shortages had spread across the country. According to the Moscow Times, gasoline was being rationed from the Baltic enclave of Kaliningrad in the far west all the way to Vladivostok in the far east, nearly the full width of the country. In some regions, drivers were limited to 10 to 20 liters per visit if they could find any fuel at all. In others, only diesel was left on the pump. Wholesale gasoline prices jumped more than 50% from the start of the year, hitting record highs while diesel climbed nearly 10% in a single month. In the Zabaikalsky region, entire station networks ran out of the lowest grade completely, and officials fell back on coupon-based rationing, the kind of measure most Russians associate with the dying days of the Soviet Union. The further you traveled from Moscow, the worse the picture became. In the far eastern Primorye region, fuel reached around 78 rubles a liter in an area where the average monthly wage is about $1,200, and desperate drivers were caught reselling gasoline online for several times that price. In annexed Crimea, roughly half of all filling stations ran dry. By May of 2026, Sevastopol began rationing gasoline, and the Kremlin-installed head of Crimea openly admitted that some refineries were, in his words, physically not functioning. The shortages had reached the very territory Russia seized to prove its strength. There is a particular humiliation in all this for the Kremlin. For 2 decades, the entire Russian social contract rested on a single promise. The state would deliver stability and a slowly rising standard of living paid for by the oil and gas under everyone's feet, and in return, the population would stay out of politics. Cheap, plentiful fuel was the most visible proof that the bargain was working. Now that proof is evaporating. A driver in Vladivostok queuing for rationed gasoline, or a farmer in the south who cannot fuel his harvest, is watching the bargain break in real time. And unlike a front line 1,000 kilometers away, an empty pump is something every Russian can see with their own eyes on their own street today. And Russia's response only advertised the weakness more loudly. It banned gasoline exports, then extended that ban again and again, keeping it in force through the end of July. It tapped its strategic reserves. It looked abroad to import fuel from Kazakhstan and Belarus, the same Russia that sells energy to half the planet, now asking smaller neighbors for gasoline. And in the most revealing move of all, it began pulling army reservists off other duties to physically guard refineries against plywood drones. Stop and picture that for a moment. An empire that conquered through sheer depth is now posting soldiers around its own gas stations. None of it is fooling anyone, least of all the Russians waiting in the queues. The economic machinery underneath was groaning too. Analysts warned that if the squeeze continued, Russia faced the threat of runaway inflation and a deeper slowdown, with interest rates already pinned near record highs to hold the line. The 2026 budget, written around a lower oil price, was an admission in spreadsheet form that the golden years of easy energy money were ending. Every export ban, every emergency import, every new layer of price control tightened the state's grip on a sector that used to run itself, and each turn of that screw is a cost in its own right. But numbers and interest rates are not what topple regimes. Behind the closed doors of the Kremlin, the real fear was never a NATO army crossing the western border. The true fear is the day ordinary Russians in Buryatia and Dagestan in the Pacific provinces finally decide that the cost of this distant war has reached their own fuel tank, their own wallet, their own town, and that the energy superpower they were promised cannot even fill a gas can. That is the one bomb no air defense system can ever intercept, because it does not come over the border. It goes off from the inside. For years, Russia believed its sheer size was its armor, that somewhere past the front there would always be a safe rear to fall back into. Ukhta ended that belief in a single morning. The empire that runs on oil now waits in line for gasoline, and the lifeblood of its war machine is leaking out of 1,750 kilometers of sky it swore no one could ever cross. The safest corner of the map has quietly become the most exposed. So here is the real question. Can Moscow still defend a country this vast from a workshop drone that costs less than the missile sent to stop it, or has distance? The one weapon Russia always trusted finally turned against it. Tell me what you think in the comments and subscribe if you want to keep watching how this map redraws itself.